Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will be talking about The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. So when these books were at like the peak of their popularity and the movies were coming out, I was definitely in their target demographic. I was very into this series when I was a teenager, as were a lot of my friends. But I haven't revisited the books since I was a teenager. This is my first time reading it as an adult. I was curious, with the new movie coming out and having rewatched the original movies recently, I was wondering sort of how these books would hold up. And I have to say, even before picking up this book to read again, my impression of the series in my memory was very favorable. The Hunger Games really just feels like an exemplary piece of YA fiction. There are a lot of similar books and a lot of imitators in that era, but none that have had the kind of cultural lasting power and the lasting power in my mind personally. And I think part of that is because I always felt like The Hunger Games was a book series for teenagers that took teenagers very seriously. It trusts young readers to handle really big topics. We have complicated characters. There's a lot of politics involved in The Hunger Games, and there's a lot of violence. But I really feel like as a series, it doesn't dumb it down to make it suit YA. It trusts the readers to understand and engage with the material. It allows the teens that are depicted in the book to be fully real and complicated human beings. I really think that The Hunger Games has a lot of depth and message that sets it apart from some similar series. And I don't know if this was the experience of other people my age, but it definitely felt remarkable in my high school because it was the only book like this that girls and boys were both reading, which is particularly impressive with the main character being a girl, especially if you look at like the statistics of how often boys read books about girls. And I gotta say, after reading it again, I still feel really good about this series. It's definitely as exciting as I remember, and I think it really holds up as a strong example of young adult fiction. So let's start talking about our lead character in The Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen, who I think is a very interesting, complex, well thought out character. When I think back to books that were kind of in this genre or adjacent to this genre that I read when I was a teenager, a lot of the female characters kind of felt like a self-insert. Like they were all just kind of normal girls that you could easily imagine yourself as, and usually strictly moral and very romanticized as this kind of ideal, maybe unrealistic version of a teenager. But I don't think Katniss is that. She's very distinctive. She feels very real in that a girl growing up in the difficult circumstances of her life would probably react to them the way Katniss does. She's a survivor and a fighter and constantly thinking about trying to portray strength. She doesn't want people to underestimate her because she's young and a girl and kind of small. And that's definitely like a necessary survival skill for her. And we see that in our first moments getting to know Katniss in this book. From the very moment she volunteers on behalf of her sister, one of her first thoughts is, I can't get sad about Prim, I can't let it make me cry because the cameras are on me and I can't have my other competitors seeing me cry. And she's having thoughts like this all throughout the book of this kind of face that she's putting on. What's interesting about her is that, yes, she is this strong, very capable person who's kind of been forced into adulthood at a young age, but she is also quite sensitive and emotional internally, and that's a side to her that she hides from almost everyone. You know, as the reader of this book, we're inside of her head, so we see every time she cries, every time her emotions get the best of her, every time she softens to these other characters. And we see the way that she has kind of a weak spot for people that remind her of Prim. And even in the games, when she has to put forth that she's this kind of warrior, inside, internally, she's really struggling with all of the death and the loss. She gets sad a lot about her fellow tributes dying. That was like an interesting moment when she's in the cave with PETA and she's thinking about how her and Thresh could have been friends if they weren't in the games together, and that she's sad that he has to die. And while she's very cold towards her mother and very resentful of what has happened in their relationship, we see that on the inside she really misses her mother's affection. So she has this whole other completely opposite side to her personality that she just can't really show because it's contrary to her survival. But it's the moments when that side of her comes out, when her kind of hard shell cracks a little bit and we see the emotions underneath, those are kind of the big Katniss moments. Those are the things that lead her to being like the face of a revolution, as we see in the later books. Because she has these moments of very real and intense feeling that she is incapable of faking. These moments when like her human spirit is revealed and she's not just a spectacle, she's a person. You know, obviously Katniss can't understand what those moments look like to other people, but we see Prim and Rue and Cinna and PETA, they all see this in her. Something else that I noticed a lot on this read is Katniss's preoccupation with food. You know, obviously this is the Hunger Games, and Katniss has been battling against hunger for a lot of years now. But she really, in this entire book, not once in or out of the games does she have a single meal that is not, you know, minutely described. She really thinks about everything she consumes and how she feels afterwards. You know, food takes up a huge amount of space in this book, and therefore a huge amount of space in Katniss's head. And that makes sense as someone who nearly starved to death and spends literally all of her free time getting more food for herself and her family. And she also notes when she's, you know, eating all of this food in the capital that everything she eats back home in District 12, she personally has to find a way to produce it. So if they're having meat, she's hunted it. If they're having, you know, roots, she gathered it. And that's placed in sharp contrast to the citizens of the capital who can have anything they want of any variety at the push of a button. And we also see her, like, as she's sizing up her other competitors and thinking about all these other people she's interacting with, she spends a lot of time thinking about what they eat. You know, she describes the career tributes as well-fed more than once. You know, she talks to Rue about the fact that though Rue's in the agriculture district and is harvesting the food, she doesn't eat any of the food she harvests. She talks to PETA about how, as a baker's son, the only bread he eats are stale leftovers. And this is really a way in for her to understand these other characters and see things from their perspective is through the lens of how they eat. And food is also like linked to these really big turning points in her life. You know, Peeta is the boy with the bread. Oh, that like loaf of bread he gave her is symbolic of her survival and her deciding to save her family. After she honors Rue in the arena, District 11 sends her bread as, you know, a gesture. You know, there's nothing else that could be more meaningful to Katniss. So food is really like the center of her worldview. You know, she's a person who spends all of her time thinking about food and hunger. And because those things are so ever present, she doesn't really have space in her head to be thinking about rebellion or love. So let's talk a little bit more about that dichotomy between survival and practicality against, you know, living a real feeling life with joy. You know, we already see as the reader that Katniss has these two sides to her personality. And she clearly chooses to express largely in the survival, like tough fighter mode. And she kind of feels some of the love and like warm, gooey feelings to kind of be superfluous to that, like things she doesn't have time for. But you know, she has that soft spot, and despite herself, these other characters like Rue and Peeta bring that out of her. These characters, they bring laughter and friendship and love and music, these things that she sees as non-essential, but we know are actually quite essential even for someone like Katniss. And I think in that is kind of where Peeta is sort of the perfect match for Katniss, because, you know, he's not just this cute boy who's there to save the day. He's a person who's different from Katniss in all the right ways to help her see a different way of living, even under the harsh circumstances of this government. You know, in this first book, and as things go on, he opens up her life to something a little more fulfilling and hopeful than just surviving to the next day. You know, he doesn't appeal to the part of her that is, you know, reactive and kind of self-protective. Because in a lot of ways, he doesn't help her survive. In other ways, he definitely does. But what he appeals to is like that secret inner self that she has that is emotional and loving. So a big part of her personal journey while she's in the games comes down to what Peeta says to her the night before they go into the arena, where he says that he doesn't want the games to change him. He wants to still be himself. And at the time that he says that to her, Katniss literally does not understand, like can't even comprehend what he's trying to say, because she's just thinking about shelter and finding water and the fights that she's gonna have. And that's what her focus is when she goes into the games, is just the steps she has to take to survive. And we know that Peeta's focus is really to protect her. And this like kind of idea of being a person and not just being a piece in the games, it doesn't click in for Katniss until Rue dies. You know, she got to know her, she considered her a friend, and Rue is not just, you know, another dead tribute. She's this smart, vibrant little girl who, despite having all of her own struggles in life, you know, loves music more than anything. Music, like music and singing, it's so representative of this other way of living in this book. You know, Peeta, his first memory of, having a crush on Katniss is hearing her sing at school when they were little kids. Because when she sings, she's showing that inner self, and then Rue asks Katniss to sing for her, and that's a real turning point for Katniss and how she's playing the games. And music is also really linked to Katniss's memories of her dad and the grief she kind of really, really holds deep inside of her. What she's kind of learning is that merely surviving is not enough. Surviving is not living, and it's going to take something more. It takes the emotions inside of her and this real self, this real human spirit that she is, to defy the Capitol. And again, those are the moments when Katniss is at her best. Those are her brilliant moments. As the games go on and as she teams up with Peeta, this gets really complicated because her expressions of love and her opening up that side of herself becomes really tied in to her survival, because they have to play these roles to earn favor with the Capitol. So something that I saw with this reread that became very clear to me much earlier than I thought is that Katniss does like Peeta. She does have feelings for him pretty quickly. She doesn't understand those feelings. She doesn't understand Peeta himself at all. And whenever these feelings bubble up, she immediately buries them in distrust. And of course, she has no long-term motivation to really think through these feelings, because they're either going to die anyways, or, she has no intention of ever marrying anyone. But despite all of that, her first reaction to so many of the things that Peeta does is warmth and like butterflies. We see in one of their very early interactions at the opening ceremonies, Peeta compliments her, and I quote, "And then he gives me a smile that seems so genuinely sweet, with just the right touch of shyness, that unexpected warmth rushes through me," which is really cute and sweet. And then her very next thought is, "A warning bell goes off in my head." And then later, after they've gotten to know each other better, at the time that they spend in the cave during the games, well, she's not really a talker. She's reaching this moment where she has to express something of her feelings. And she has this thought a couple different times that she wishes that she could say this in privacy. She wishes she could say this without knowing there are cameras there. And I think that feeling of wanting it to be private is because of the part of those feelings for Peeta that are very real. Her first thought in that moment isn't really not wanting to have to say that, but just not wanting it to be on display, like wanting it to be kind of pure. Katniss is not good at communicating her feelings. After the game, she certainly can't express or parse out what was real. But you can tell as a reader that enough of it is definitely real. Way back when they were at the reaping and she volunteered as tribute, she wasn't showing her tears, but Peeta just cried openly. And her just not understanding that and not understanding him at all, I think is kind of what makes it work. They're like exactly different enough, and she's kind of intrigued by that. Yeah, those moments are all over this book of Peeta doing something very, noble, or saying something sweet, or them having a moment of affection. And her first reaction is always kind of that it feels good and that she likes him, and she's always getting these like rushes of warmth. You know, at the point in this book, she is not quite out of the survival mindset enough to go much further than that, to allow her mind to go much further than that. And that's kind of why this series like doesn't really feel like a love triangle thing, because despite Gale liking Katniss, he never elicits feelings like that in her. She mostly just sees him as a friend, and then, you know, later in the series, she just kind of feels a lot of guilt around him. Okay, anyways, so Katniss's main motivations at this point in the story are to survive and to protect the people who are most important to her. So having that kind of focus and just trying to get through this, how does she end up in these kind of rebellious acts that are, you know, a spark in the districts? And I really think it comes down to, again, this kind of external, internal thing with Katniss. You know, people expect her, once she's in the games, to be brutal. You know, that's the trap that the tributes nearly always fall into, is just focusing on their own survival, focusing on the next day, and seeing each other as the enemy. And Katniss could certainly do that, and there's a lot of moments where she does do that. It's a part of her. You know, her first instinct when they make the announcement at the end that her and Peeta cannot both win the games, she raises her bow against him. That's the first thing she does, but she lowers it after, because she has this emotional core that she just can't quite resist, that's always pulling her to be something more than just an entertaining piece of the games. You know, she has her temper, her tears, her kind of soft spot for the underdog. You know, and she never plans for this, but she's kind of this bright, living young woman in an inhuman world, and if you put her in front of a camera, it's sort of inevitable. So like, even volunteering is kind of her first act of that. You know, it says in the book that most siblings don't do that. You know, people don't volunteer for their siblings. They just kind of accept the fate of that sibling leaving. And then when Rue dies, you know, they have that moment where she sings to her, and after she passes, the practical thing to do would be for Katniss to kind of wipe her tears and move on. That's the expected thing. But she has this moment of, you know, these other tributes aren't my enemy. It's the Capitol, it's the game makers, and she wants to shame them. That's the word that's used. And that's why she decorates Rue with the flowers and has this kind of mourning for her that is not typical in the games. And then finally, you know, her trick with the nightlock berries that saves her and Peeta, that's a moment of her understanding that Peeta is not the person she's fighting against. The person she's fighting against is, you know, the Capitol, the people off screen, the ones watching. Those are the ones that she's challenging in that moment. And this is a world where you cannot challenge the Capitol. It's such a really nice, interesting take, I think, on a revolutionary who never intends to be revolutionary, but she's just this child who has a lot of big emotions and can't help but act upon them when she knows that this world she's living in is wrong. Okay, so that is all I'll say about The Hunger Games. I really enjoyed revisiting this book and kind of thinking about the impression it made on me as a teenager. You know, I'm an adult. I generally read books written for adults at this age, but it's nice to occasionally revisit books like this, especially this series. I really have such a fondness for it. So I'm definitely gonna read the next 2 books, and I'll read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which I've never read before. Yeah, I'm excited to make a few more videos on this series, so stay tuned for those. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.